Welcome to today's Harvard Business Review webinar. It's called Design an Agenda for an Effective Meeting. I'm Julia Kirby. I want to thank you all for joining us today. We really want this to be an interactive webinar, so if you have questions or comments at any time, just type your question in the chat box in the lower left corner of your screen, and we'll turn to those once our presenter has finished his prepared remarks. Now, to download a copy of today's presentation, you'll want to click on the Resources icon in the lower left corner of your screen. And if you need help at any time during the presentation, please just click on the Help icon in the lower right corner of your screen. We also have a conversation going on at Twitter, and you can find us at HBR Exchange, and let's all use the hashtag HBR Webinar. We've all been in meetings where participants are unprepared or people veer off track. The topics discussed seem like a waste of the team's time. These problems and others like them often come from an agenda that was poorly designed or in some cases just completely missing. But an effective agenda can set clear expectations. It allows members to prepare beforehand. It ensures time is used well. The topic is focused, and if problems still occur during the meeting, a well-designed agenda increases the team's ability to effectively and quickly address them. So why don't more people do this? Well, they often don't really know how. So today, Roger Schwartz is here with us to share some practical tips for designing an effective agenda that can improve the performance of your team. Roger Schwartz is an organizational psychologist and speaker and leadership team consultant. He's also president and CEO of Roger Schwartz and Associates. He helps leadership teams get positive results along three dimensions: strong performance, solid working relationships, and individual well-being. He also helps learning and organization development, HR, and process improvement consultants improve how they help teams. He's the author of Smart Leaders, Smarter Teams, How You and Your Team Get Unstuck to Get Results, and The Skilled Facilitator, a comprehensive resource for consultants, facilitators, managers, trainers, and coaches. Roger, it's great to have you here. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Julia. It's great to be here.
Well, let me just start out by saying, look, we all love to complain about meetings. We moan about the waste of time and the lack of outcomes. But I guess what's really going on here? Aren't the complaints really pointing to a bigger issue?
I think when people are complaining about meetings, they're complaining about a number of different things. And this is true whether you are sending out the meeting invite or whether you're receiving the meeting invite. Meetings are almost like a magnet for all of our concerns and hopes about what can happen in a team and what can happen in an organization. And the main question that usually comes up for us when we're faced with a meeting invitation is, is this meeting going to be a good use of my time? If people want to make sure that their time is well spent in organizations, pretty reasonable request. And it's often not the case that their time is well spent in meetings. So that's the main question that people are asking. And then as part of that, people are thinking, are we going to make decisions that are going to move the team, the organization forward? If we're making decisions, are we going to get to the real issues, or are we going to somehow avoid them, skirt around them? Then once we're in the meeting, are people going to stay on track, or are people going to get off track, and then we won't be able to accomplish what it is that we really need from the meeting? And then people are worried, are people going to actually listen to each other, or are people just going to come to the meetings with whatever their preferred solutions are, and everyone will try to convince everyone else to do it their way? So there are lots of things that people are concerned about, rightly so, about meetings. And some of those issues can be addressed in the meeting. Some of them need to be addressed outside of the meeting. A number of them can be addressed through really designing the meeting effectively. And that's really what the focus is for our conversation today. How can you use an agenda to really address some of those critical questions that everyone has, whether they're the person, as I said, inviting others to the meeting or whether you've been invited to the meeting. So that's where we're really headed today. And I want to talk just briefly about where we're headed and the agenda for this meeting, so to speak. So if you're looking on your slides, you should see there's an agenda for the webinar, and that agenda has 7 points on it. And I want to go through briefly and just give you an idea of where we're headed for the session. So we've just finished that second part that says meetings, what's really going on here, and spending a couple minutes now talking with you about the rest of the agenda. I'll spend about 30 minutes after this piece talking about 10 points that you can use to really design an effective agenda for whatever meeting you're designing. And as part of that, Julia will chime in and ask questions, and it'll be more interactive. Then after that 30 minutes, we're going to be opening it up to questions from all of you, and we'll be taking your questions through the chat box, and I'll be responding to those. And then at the end, I'll say a little bit about additional resources. If you found this webinar useful, what are some other things that you can learn that are related to creating more effective meetings and teams? And then Julia will close at the end. So that's where we're headed. So with that, let's talk about the 10 points for designing an effective agenda. The first point is this. You need to seek input from team members. That may seem like a really obvious point, but it's often not followed. It's often the case that the person who is putting together the meeting puts together the agenda based upon his or her own views about what needs to be addressed in the meeting. And if you want people to attend the meeting, first of all, and then if you want them to be engaged during the meeting, you want to make sure you get their input for the agenda, because that's what will lead people to be engaged, to be discussing the issues that they think are important. And it's a pretty simple process to do that. All you need to do is to ask people beforehand to suggest agenda items and ask them to explain what is it about that agenda item that's related to the purpose of the meeting as you've described it. And that'll help you decide, does this make sense to include on the agenda, or does it not make sense to include on this particular agenda? There's not a requirement that you add every item that someone suggested for the meeting. But it's important that if you don't include an item on the agenda, that you explain to people why you didn't include it. That's part of being accountable. Because if you take suggestions, you don't put those suggestions on the agenda, and you don't explain why, then you're automatically going to be reducing the chance that people will make suggestions in the future. If you've got a team that you meet with regularly, this may be a team of your direct reports, it's easy to set up a process where this is done week to week in a way that's pretty automated. And what I mean by that is create a shared space on your server where people can go in advance and they can put in suggested items for the agenda. And then you and other people can decide what items should be on the agenda. If it's a meeting that doesn't occur regularly, then you probably need a different kind of process for that. But in any event, make sure that you're getting input from team members in order to really increase the engagement for the meeting itself. So that's the first point. The second point is to select topics that affect the entire team or that require coordination among many team members. Okay. So what I mean by that is team time is really difficult to schedule, and it's really expensive. If you start adding up the compensation costs for 10 senior leaders for 2-hour meetings, you can quickly realize how expensive it is. So you don't want to waste team members' time, or your own time for that matter, by using team meetings to simply share information or provide updates. You want to focus on issues where almost everyone in the meeting has a stake in the issues you're discussing and the decisions that you're making. And if you're wondering a lot of...
Roger,
Julie,
maybe I can jump in there and ask a quick question, just because you dangled this complete red meat of talking about the expensive meetings, which I have to jump on. I mean, so we're all so aware of that, but I guess I wonder how much should that factor into what the meeting topics are? Should team leaders kind of try to create a little more awareness in the team of how expensive 10 minutes of this meeting is, and should that factor into the selection of what to put on the agenda?
I think the answer is yes. I think if you're in a team meeting and you're responsible for that team meeting, I think one of the things that you need to be responsible for are the costs associated with it. We think of people's time. That's obvious by the fact that they're in a meeting room for a certain period of time. But we often don't go to that next step and say, what does that cost us? And so if you start to think about what it will cost you, then you can ask the question, how do we make the value of this meeting greater, given that the cost is fixed? And that leads you to design the agendas more effectively. It leads you to make sure that people who need to be there are there, and people who don't need to be there aren't there. Those are all ways of really increasing the value by having the right people in the room and getting the cost in line. So I think that's absolutely critical, and it's rarely done. People think of it as a sunk cost, and sometimes the word sunk becomes very true in a lot of ways. So yeah, that's something that people should definitely be taking into account. And one main way to increase the value, given the fixed cost, is to focus on those topics that are really critical to the people in the room. And a lot of that revolves around this issue of interdependence. So when you bring people together to talk about topics, and they're not really interdependent with each other around the topic. That is, that they don't take work from each other, they don't give work to each other. That's what makes them interdependent. When that's not true, then either the topic can be easily dealt with without having a meeting, okay, or it doesn't need to involve typically all the people who are in the meeting. Okay? And this is often something that I see, I'll say, violated in many of the meetings that I'm observing, that people put meetings on the agenda that don't involve most of the people, or involve most of the people, but only in a way that involves sharing information or updating people, which is a really poor use of the time. Okay? So one of the fundamental questions you want to ask yourself is, are the people in the room all interdependent with each other around the issue that we're talking about? So if the issue is how do we increase our response time to customers, then you want to make sure that everyone in the room has a piece of that puzzle in answering the question and is giving, is part of the workflow in ensuring that response time is decreased. If they're not, then you have to ask the question, why are they in the meeting? They may not have relevant information to provide, and they are likely not to be engaged as a result of that, or they're not likely to be impacted by the decision. Okay? So those are criteria to think about.
I can think of another corollary to what you're saying, which is, especially as you're inviting people to put things on the agenda, it may be that in fact there are some people with interdependencies who weren't going to be in that meeting, which if that now is going to be on the agenda, maybe you need to invite some additional people in. Does that just mean that you need to ask for those agenda items far enough in advance that if you wanted to put that on the agenda, you could bring those additional people in, or is that just a reason to tell somebody, no, that's out of scope for this meeting?
The folks in the field of systems thinking have a saying, which is, get the system in the room. And what that means practically is that if you're trying to solve a problem, you need all the people who have the significant pieces of the puzzle to address that. If you don't have some of those people, and they're necessary to make the decision, then you're wasting the time of everyone else who is in that meeting, because you will have spent time on the discussion and not have been able to reach a decision, or reach a decision that may not be taking into account some of the key factors that you need to be taking into account. So the answer is yes. You want to make your agenda early enough so that you can ask the question, who needs to be involved in this part of the meeting in order for us to have all the relevant information we need to make a good decision? Absolutely. And it doesn't mean that just because someone is in the meeting, they have to be there for the entire meeting. Part of being judicious and doing the math about costs is to say, which people need to be here for which agenda items. People will be very happy to come at the appropriate time and leave at the appropriate time. So that's a key part of it. Another key part to think about, just in terms of selecting topics that are really going to have an impact on everyone, is the extent to which the people that you're bringing together are, in fact, a team. And that may sound like a strange thing, but one of the things that I find is that leaders often try to get their, quote, team together to deal with issues that aren't really issues because the team isn't a team. Quick story, I worked with a VP from a global transportation company a number of years ago, and he had 22 people reporting to him. And he was frustrated because they weren't working as a team. He was concerned that they weren't handing off work appropriately, and they weren't getting problem solved at a really significant way. And after watching the group, I said to them, listen, I think the real problem here is that you're not really a team, but you're trying to act like one. You don't have the kind of interdependence among you that would require you to solve some of the problems that you're trying to solve. And I remember the vice president was pretty annoyed with me in the meeting as I said that, and then came back later and said, you're right. I didn't have a team. I had a group of people who I had brought together. And so he reconstituted his leadership team so that everyone who reported to him was really interdependent with each other in order to accomplish the task of that part of the organization. And then, when they actually dealt with issues, they got dealt with because everyone had an investment and everyone had a piece of the puzzle. And so there's a structural problem that many teams have. They get people into their meetings, and they're wondering, why aren't people engaged and why aren't people motivated? And the leaders begin to make negative attributions about their direct reports. This person doesn't really care about this. They're not a team player. When in fact, some of the time, it's that there isn't a role for people to play given the way these agendas are being set. So that's a very subtle but powerful influence on how teams and team meetings run effectively. So those are the first two tips, which are about selecting input from team members and selecting topics appropriately. So let's go on to the third topic. The third topic is to list topics as questions to answer. And if you're looking on the PowerPoint, you can see that I've circled the first column under topic. Most of the agendas that I see are written as a few words put together to describe an agenda item. And the example that I often give is a topic that says something like office space reallocation, 3 words. And you get that agenda and you think to yourself, office space reallocation, what does that mean? Are they reallocating my office? Am I going to lose it? Does this mean everyone's going to be moved to a different building? And it often generates a lot of questions, sometimes a lot of anxiety. What it doesn't generate is the ability to prepare for the meeting appropriately. So what I suggest to my clients is, instead of writing out topics as a few nouns strung together, even a sentence, write them out as a question or questions that need to be answered. So in the case of the office space reallocation, it might say something like, under what conditions, if any, should we reallocate office space? And the nice thing about having a question like that is, first of all, it enables you to prepare for that conversation before the meeting. You know what is going to be asked. Second is, when you're in the meeting, you can monitor your own contributions. You can ask yourself, is what I'm about to say on topic for this question? And the third thing that you can do is, when you think someone else is talking about something that's off track when you're supposed to be on that topic, you can say to them, I hear what you're saying. I'm not sure how that relates to the question of what are the conditions under which we should reallocate office space. Can you help me understand how that relates to the topic we're talking about, or if not, can we come back to the other topic? Okay? And finally, what that does is, if you put the topic in the form of a question, people know when the discussion is finished. It's finished when you've adequately answered the question. So for a lot of reasons, it makes sense to do that. That is not as easy as it sounds, and it's not as easy as it sounds because sometimes it's not clear to you when it's your meeting or it's your topic, what are the questions you're really trying to answer? And if it's not as easy as it sounds, what that means is that you really need to spend some time getting clarity before the meeting. What am I trying to do here? What do we really need to answer? What are the key questions? That's good planning, and that means you're saving time in the meeting if you can really clarify the questions.
So I love this idea that you would put these things as questions, in part because what it signals to the team in the room is that you expect them to be sharing a point of view, and maybe that's not always clear that that's what people should be doing in meetings.
Yeah, they're sharing a point of view, and another piece, Julia, that you remind me of is that a question is an invitation for curiosity. And often what's missing in many meetings is people being curious. We have people spending a lot of time telling each other their points of view, and sometimes they even explain their point of view. But what's often lacking is curiosity, learning from each other. And the question is a nice way of teeing that up, of saying, here, this is a question that we need to jointly answer together. So I think it has the ability to set a particular, let's say, environment, maybe too strong a word, but set a tone for how you want to proceed in the conversation. So that's the third point for designing effective agendas. The fourth point is to note the purpose of the topic. And that's simply a matter of identifying whether the purpose for the topic is to make a decision, is it to discuss a topic but not yet make a decision, or is it to update and share information? Those are the three main purposes that meetings have. And you notice on the screen, it just so happens that the purposes of the topics that I've circled all have the same purpose, which is to make a decision. And I would say that's pretty much as it should be. You should be spending the vast majority of your meeting time on discussing issues that lead to a decision. Because if you're not, you're probably not using team members' time as well as you could. Lots of time is often spent on just giving updates. And those are things that can go in an email, they can be put on your internal website. If they don't need conversation, there's really not a need for them to be in the meeting. People can do it on their own time, and it's a much better use. The second purpose, which is to have a discussion, that is appropriate meeting time. And you may have a discussion that doesn't lead to a decision, and that's fine, because some discussions have to occur over periods of meetings or periods of time, and they may not be ripe, so to speak, for a discussion, for a decision. Ultimately, that's where you want them to lead. Okay? So I would encourage you to think through the agendas that you have put together and ask yourself, What's the percentage of topics where we're really looking for a decision? And if you find yourself realizing that very few of the topics require a decision, there are a couple possibilities. One is that you're not involving folks in this team as effectively as you could, but another more fundamental issue may be that you don't have a group of people in the room with you whose responsibility is to make a decision around that, which then leads us back to the question of why are you putting topics on the agenda that are a mismatch for their roles.
So it strikes me that your previous point about listing the topics as questions and this point are really mutually reinforcing, because if the purpose is a decision, then it's pretty easy to come up with the question. And if you are having trouble posing something as a question, it's probably signaling to you that you're using the meeting to do something other than to make a decision.
Exactly. And if you're posing the topic as a question and then you think to yourself, well, I don't really want the folks in this meeting to answer this question, then that's the time to do some reflection about why is the team there. So we've got a number of things already laid out, right? We've got the people in the room, ideally they're the right people in the room. We've listed these agenda topics as questions. We're clear about what the purpose of the topic is. The next point is to calculate a realistic amount of time for each topic. And here I'm circling the amount of time for the topics that are listed on the agenda. This is another place where people often really create ineffective meetings because they consistently underestimate the amount of time it takes to discuss a topic and to reach a decision on it. And as a result, decisions are either rushed or they're delayed, and then later topics on the agenda get pushed to later meetings, and then people who needed decisions on those later topics that weren't addressed get frustrated. So the key point here is simple. Do the math. Do the math. What I mean by that is, for example, if you've got a topic and you've allocated 10 minutes for that topic and you have 10 people in the room to make a decision on that question, if you've got anything other than the simplest question to address, you'd realize by doing the math that after each person spoke once for 1 minute, at the end of that 10 minutes, you would have had to have reached a decision. Otherwise, you'd already be over your time. So when you're doing the math, it's important to think about there's a certain amount of time, so everyone's in agreement about what are the issues we're going to be considering within the topic. Right? Are we all agreed on the assumptions that we're operating from? Are we all agreed on the needs or the criteria that have to be met in this decision? Do we all agree about what the information is that we're considering, and so forth? Okay? And all of those turn out to be factors in estimating the time. And I put a slide on here that says, do the math, estimating time for a topic. So let me make an analogy here that will help you think about time and how to calculate it. If you've ever worked with an architect, you know that there are three basic variables to consider. One is the cost of the building. Second is how big the building is in square feet. And the third is the quality of materials that go into it. And as the client, you get to choose any of those two variables, and then the architect will tell you what the figure is for that third variable. So, for example, if you say you want to build a house that costs, $750,000 and is 3,000 square feet, your architect will tell you, well, given that, this is the cost of materials that you can have per square foot. Okay? If you tell them the cost of materials or the quality of materials and how big the home has to be, that person will tell you what the cost is. Well, it's the same with meetings. So here's the triangle for meetings in front of you, and there are three variables: the number of people in the meeting, the complexity of the topic, and the amount of time required to reach a decision on the topic. And so you can imagine very easily that as the number of people goes up and the complexity goes up, so will the amount of time. You can't magically keep the time the same as the number of people goes up and the complexity goes up. One of those has to give. So if you have a meeting and you're told you only have 2 hours for that meeting, and you have to have 10 people in that meeting, then the only variable you have to play with is the number of topics and the complexity of each of those topics. That's the only variable you have to play with. Right? And that's often the case. You often have a fixed amount of time, at least initially, and there's a certain number of people who have to be there by virtue of the topic. So then you're playing around with how many topics can we deal with. Right? So think about those three variables. I wish I could give you a very specific formula, but it's really a matter of practice and learning from the practice. So keep track of when you go over time so that you can say at the next meeting, and when you plan for it, it looks like it really took us 15 minutes to talk about something that I thought it was going to take 5 minutes, or it took us an hour to talk about something that was going to take a half hour. Where did we underestimate? So that over time, you're improving your process to realistically lay out and estimate times on the agenda.
So, Roger, a lot of times a conversation will unexpectedly take off. Like people will have more energy around it than you anticipated, or maybe they realize they are disagreeing in a way that they didn't expect to when they came in. So, how much should we be just kind of playing this by ear in the room, and how quickly should you sort of say, hey, we got to table this, and we're just going to have to give this more time on the next meeting?
I think that if you're planning your agendas well, and as you get better at them, first of all, you will include time for things you didn't expect, what I call flex time. So that's one thing to consider. I often will say, let's plan to meet for an hour and hope we don't need it. And I will schedule the agenda in a way where I think it will take less than an hour. People will be very happy when you finish a meeting early. I've never heard anyone say, I'm really disappointed we finished earlier. Okay? So I think that's one thing that you can do. You can hold it off to a next meeting, but here's the problem. If you hold it off to a next meeting, then when you come back to it, there is extra time required to get up to speed and help people remember where they were and what everyone was thinking. And so that's a loss. I would rather ask, can we take more time here and, again, put off some of those or maybe one of the other topics that we've been talking about, okay? Rather than just come back to this at a later date. But you want to do that in a way that what I call joint design. That is, you don't make that decision on your own. You don't say, oh, we're out of time. The agenda said that we were going to stop now, so we're going to stop now. That's what I call a unilateral move. You note where you are in the agenda and that you haven't finished where you thought you would be, and you check to see quickly, what does it make sense to do? And you get a sense from the other people in the room about that. And to the extent possible, you jointly design it. People will have information that you may not have thought of there. Right? And again, if you're constantly doing that, then one of the things you should be learning is you're consistently underestimating time, maybe on particular kinds of topics. Okay?
Now, this point you make about complexity, I love that you use the word complexity. I guess I'm wondering about whether the amount that the decision could be supported by data might affect that. You know, if it's kind of the data will help us make the decision to a large extent, then I could imagine that being a pretty short discussion once the data is out on the table. But if it's something where it really just involves a lot of tacit knowledge sharing and it is not going to be a data-driven decision, then that's going to be part of that complexity, right?
Absolutely. The greater uncertainty there is, the greater the environment is dynamic and changing. All of those things are complex. And another part of complexity that we haven't talked about is the complexity of being able to talk about these issues. One of the things that I help teams do is discuss the undiscussable issues, the issues that are often underlying the issues that people are talking about, but they don't know how to talk about those underlying issues. They're the drivers. That takes a fair amount of skill to do that. And if teams don't talk about those issues, the complexity becomes greater because of that. So that's another element.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's kind of like complexity can also mean how fraught is the topic. Exactly.
Yes, fraught is a key variable in complexity. So let's talk about the next point here, which is to propose a process for each topic. This is honored mostly in a breach. I have rarely seen agendas that have a proposed process as part of the agenda. And what I mean by process is, what steps will the team take in the meeting to get from the posing of the question to the answering of the question? And if you look on that slide, you can see I've suggested a process for answering the question, how do we best manage the fluctuating internal demand for our services? And I've got a 5-step process there. First is statement of the problem, then identify and agree on what the relevant information is we need to consider, then identify and agree on the criteria for what would be an acceptable solution, next identify and agree on the assumptions that are guiding us, and then craft solutions that meet those above constraints. Okay? And I've put time aside for each part of the process. When you put together a process, well, actually, let me go back. When there's no process for an agenda item, and even if it's an agenda question, if there's no process, then what happens is everyone in that meeting tries to address the question using a process that they think makes sense. And even when everyone is operating in perfectly good faith, trying to have an effective meeting, they're still trying to move the conversation forward given their understanding of what would be an effective process. And that means people have different processes in their head because there hasn't been one agreed on. And then that makes the conversation more difficult because not only are you trying to manage the content where you have different views, but you're trying to manage the process because everyone has their own process that they're putting in place, but people aren't talking about that, so it makes it even more difficult. So what this does is it simply says, the first thing we're going to do before we dive into the content of the topic is we're going to agree on what the process is. And it's just a proposed process. And then you ask people, does this process work? Is there anything that I'm missing? And when you get a proposed process in place at the beginning of a conversation, it serves as a roadmap. That means everyone knows the steps that you're going to be moving through, generally how much time roughly you'll be spending on each step, and that allows everyone to stay on track and to monitor their own contributions again. And again, it enables anyone in the meeting to say to someone, hey, it looks like you're moving on to crafting solutions. That's step 5 in the process. I'm thinking we're still at the point of identifying relevant information. Did I miss something there? Okay? So everyone now shares accountability for ensuring that we're at the same step of the process. And that is another way of making the organization, or rather the team meeting, more effective by sharing accountability. So this process does a lot of work in a meeting. And in order to come up with a process, it takes some time. That's not something you just slap together at the last minute when you're putting an agenda together. You want to be thinking about how can the group best move through this meeting or this topic in the meeting. So expect to spend some time on your own identifying what that process is. Now, it doesn't have to be you all the time, because who's ever responsible for that part of the agenda can suggest what that process is. But there needs to be a purpose that's suggested, and that also enables people to prepare more.
One thing that occurs to me as you're talking about this is that it's really great training in decision making. I mean, what you're doing is kind of making transparent the leader's thinking about what's the right kind of decision making toolkit to match with what kind of decision, And by making that transparent, they're actually sort of teaching the whole team how to think about that very important question of just how do I make a good decision.
That's absolutely right, Julia. What's interesting to me, it's ironic, is that many times the organizations that I'm working with are engaged in process improvement. They have Six Sigma, they have Lean, they have other kinds of process improvement approaches, and yet when you look in a meeting, they don't often have a proposed process for going through the topics. So if you are in an organization that uses some sort of process improvement approach, you probably have at your fingertips some processes you can use for moving through topics, and I suggest you go to those if you haven't already done so and adopt them for these agenda items. There are some generic processes that are used that start with identifying on all the relevant information, the assumptions, and the criteria, then moving to a kind of brainstorming and generating solution stage, and then ultimately selecting solutions based upon the criteria. But you probably have access to those in your own organization, so I encourage you to go and look at those. The seventh point about making these meetings and agendas more effective is to state how members should prepare. So if you want people to come prepared to the meeting, tell people in advance what the preparation is, put it in the agenda, include it in the meeting invitation, and as Julia mentioned earlier, send it out in enough time so people can read it. That's pretty straightforward. Those preparation elements should be all the things that people need so that they can start the conversation around the topic without having to get an update from other people. The eighth point is to identify who's leading the topic. Just because it's your meeting doesn't mean that you have to lead the whole meeting. You have topics in that meeting that probably speak to different people's expertise or area of responsibility. And so it makes sense to have them lead that part of the meeting. That increases the shared responsibility and accountability in the team and in the meeting. And if you put people's name in advance, then everyone will know who is responsible for that, and especially the person who is responsible will know and can come prepared. Obviously, you should be telling that person also and checking to see whether they have any concerns about doing that. So that's the eighth point. Ninth point is to begin with changes to the agenda. So the first item on each agenda that I put together, after introductions at least, says something like, what changes, if any, should we make to the agenda? And that's there because between the time you put together the agenda and the time you have the meeting, things happen. And sometimes some of those things that happen make the agenda that you put together either obsolete or at least not as relevant as it might have been. So a quick check in the beginning will enable you to find out, do we need to make any changes to the agenda? In the article that I wrote on which this webinar is based, I talk about a situation where working with an organization, and that was the first topic on the agenda, and we came to it. The CEO said, well, I think I need to tell you that since we scheduled this meeting, I've announced my resignation to the board of directors, and so I think we need to talk about some other agendas or other items on the agenda. So not all those changes to the agenda will be as dramatic as that, but if people think they're in a meeting that's not reflecting the most up-to-date needs, they're also likely to be less engaged. The last point is this: end the meeting with a plus delta. Those of you who do process improvement are probably familiar with plus deltas. They ask two simple questions. What did we do well for this meeting, and what should we do differently for the next meeting? If you meet regularly with a team, this enables you from week to week or every other week, however often you meet, to ensure that you're getting better at having these meetings. You might find out that your time isn't being estimated accurately. You might find out that there isn't enough time for preparation. Whatever you find out, you can then act on and get better at the next meeting. And at the next meeting, you can quickly review the plus delta from the previous meeting to make sure that you're doing those things differently. Even if you're not meeting over regularly with a team, this is still useful because any learning you can glean from a meeting with a group, you can apply to almost any other group. So those are the 10 points about designing an agenda for an effective meeting. And they will go a long way to help you create meetings that people are willing and interested in attending because they realize they're going to get something valuable out of it, and that they're willing to engage in, and then can become a model for other people in terms of what they do. This is not a panacea. There are many other things that you can do to make meetings more effective, and those go beyond the agenda. But in terms of focusing on the agenda, these will get you a very long way.
Great. Should we move to questions now that are coming in from other folks, Roger?
Let's do that.
I'm going to go first to a question that relates to pre-reading, because we really didn't spend much time on that at all, but a lot of people do struggle with that. So I guess, are there any rules of thumb about what pre-reading is supposed to do to prep the person? I guess not just how much pre-reading you can assign, but should this be more in the mode of, if there's a decision to be made, giving them maybe two different points of view on that decision, or should it be more about just arming everybody with the same base of data and knowledge about the topic to have a fruitful discussion?
In the ideal, the preparation reading should enable everyone to come to the meeting with the same background information. That's the ideal. That can't always happen because some of the background information is already in people's heads, and it's hard to get into paper and time and so forth. But to the extent that there's already something written down, or some people are willing to write something that will lay out the issues, then you close the gap in terms of who has what pieces of information, and you start the conversation further along. Okay? It's important when you send that information, you just don't send it out. It's important to say, here's how this information that we're asking you to read relates to the decisions we're asking you to make. If you don't make that link, then you make it harder for people to prepare well. What I tend not to have clients do is to identify several fixed alternatives and say, these are the alternatives, here are the pros and cons for each. And the reason for that is because one of the great values of getting together in a meeting is to craft solutions that no one thought of individually, and that takes into account information in a way that people hadn't taken into account before. And when you set out things in advance saying, here are the three options, it leads people to focus on their preferred option and then come to the meeting with as long a list of pros for their solution as they can, and as long a list of cons for other solutions that they don't believe in. And that just sets people up to focus on what's called positions rather than underlying interests and needs. So what I do ask people to do to prepare is to say, let's get clear about what are all the needs that you think have to be met regardless of the specifics of the solution. What are all the pieces of relevant information that you think people have to understand in order to craft a good solution? And what are the assumptions that you think we need to really consider as valid? And if people have those three elements in place, then the conversation can start off much further along than it would otherwise.
Here's a question that I have to share with you. I think it'll warm your heart, because it's from someone who says, I have been attempting to use this agenda model for the last few months. So, see, Roger, you're having an impact already. But she says, I have a lot of trouble getting people on board with the idea that meetings are not for sharing information. How do you explain this to other people? I guess my read of that is, there seems to be kind of a meeting culture that's taken hold, and are you really talking about cultural change? So
if you're having a problem with people thinking, well, meetings are for sharing information. I would get curious. I'd actually have a meeting, and the question on the agenda would be something like, how do we craft our meetings so that they make best use of our resources? And one of those sub-questions might be, if you feel like it's appropriate use of meeting time for sharing information, say some more. What are your thoughts about that? What needs are you trying to meet? Because it may be that people are using the meeting time or seeing meeting time as a valuable place to share information because there's no other way to get information in an organization. It's sort of an information desert. And so that's their only way to do it. And the question would become, if there are other ways of doing it that don't require you to be in a meeting, and you can use those meetings for more effective, conversations, would that be helpful? That's a question I'd want to ask. Another question might be, is there some need that people have that's a social need that is being met by coming together? Because sometimes people don't meet. They're in their cubicles, they're in their offices, they're meeting virtually, whatever it is, and so that is seen as having a social benefit. And I don't want to underestimate the social benefit of meetings, but there are many other ways of meeting that social need other than having people get together to update information with each other. So I'd get at what's the underlying need that's driving that. That's the place I'd go.
That point you made about the social function is great. And here's another way that meetings get used that someone is hinting at, which is to sort of signal that all these topics are important. So she's asking, what if you've got a diverse group of people who are, in typical kind of executive committee fashion, all coming together, and maybe one's from communications and one's from operations and one's from R&D, and don't you have to worry about divvying up the time kind of evenly to just keep reinforcing that these things are all equally important?
Well, underlying that question about divvying up the time is this issue, again, of interdependence. As you rise higher in an organization, hierarchically speaking, you get further away from the actual work of the organization, and that means you get further away from natural interdependence that flows from the actual work. And so in those higher-level meetings, the kind of interdependence that exists is typically around issues of strategy or policy. And if you're discussing topics that are not around strategy that has an impact on everyone or a policy that has an impact on everyone, then it looks like a kind of show and tell. If any of you remember that from grade school, where everyone gets up and shares what they have to say and you wait for your turn. And that can be interesting, but it's also not a good use of time. And so it goes back to the question, what are you using the team for? If you're using it for updates, then it's not a good use of time. If you're using it to make decisions, then it should be decisions around which everyone has a piece of the puzzle. And yes, if you've got people who are heading up different functions, you do want to allocate the time in a way that people can get their different needs met. That doesn't mean it has to be allocated equally, because at various times in an organization's life, some issues are much more significant than others. And some need to be attended to with more time than others. But it does need to take into account the interdependence still.
I'm going to combine a couple questions here that both have to do with capture, basically. Somebody is asking, do you recommend taking minutes? And someone else saying, how should you collect the action points that come up during the meeting?
I suggest that people take, and I'll say minutes, and I'll put quotes around that word, using real-time, either like a screen. So if I'm in the meeting with a group, I will be actually sitting at my laptop. I may be facilitating that meeting as a consultant, and I am not taking notes per se, but identifying the decisions that the group is making and brief explanation about the reasoning for that, so that they have a record of what the decision is and how they came to make it. And the value of that is, if someone is doing that real time, you can ask people to check immediately, is there anything going up here that is inconsistent with what we agreed on, or what the reasoning was? And so you don't have to have people review the minutes of the meeting. The essence is captured there, and there's an agreement reached on it before the meeting is ended. The other thing it does is it sets the pace. It enables you, when you are going through the process of the particular topic, it enables you to identify on the screen where you are on the process and what are the key things that people are identifying, and at any point say to people, if something goes up here that is inconsistent with what you said, flag it. So it actually helps to pace the meeting so that the group doesn't get ahead of what they think they've agreed on. And that saves time in a lot of ways. I don't think that minutes that are detailed minutes of what everyone says are all that useful if the purpose is to come to an agreement and that agreement captures the reasoning.
What about, would it be a good idea to just add an additional column to your agenda to the right of proposed process that just said what we decided, and then recirculate the agenda after the meeting with the bottom line on each of these things?
You could do that, and in fact, some teams have templates for their meetings that have a column exactly like that.
Let's talk now about roles in the meeting and whether that's something that should be thought about in advance. So, for instance, if a part of a meeting is focused on making a decision, then sometimes people assign someone to play a devil's advocate kind of role. Do you like to see that, and is that something that should be thought about in advance?
I am not an advocate of a devil's advocate. I couldn't resist. I think that each person should come to the meeting and be able to discuss the topic in a way that they are passionate about their own view and at least as equally curious about other people's views. And if everyone does that, then you will create a conversation in which people will learn from each other. And that's what's really needed, and that's what team meetings are for. They're for people to learn with and from each other around important issues for the team. And I think the devil's advocate role is a role that's unnecessary if people are playing their roles in a way that's appropriate and genuine.
We're getting close to the top of the hour. This may be our last question, depending on the length of the answer, but it seems like a great one. Just someone is saying, our meetings seem to create a lot more action items than they do decisions, and I guess my interpretation of that is that they're going back for more analysis and kicking the can down the road instead of being decisive in the room. But he's asking, in your opinion, what are we doing wrong?
So, two thoughts about that. If the kinds of action items that are generated are action items to collect more information, that raises two questions in the sort of plus delta category. One is, what are we failing to anticipate that we could better anticipate? So we have that information available up front. You might ask people as part of the agenda, here's a tentative agenda. Given this topic, what information do you think we need to have available in the room or before the meeting in order to reach a decision? That's the first thing. The second thing is, are you engaging in, paralysis by analysis is the term we often use, where people are reluctant to make decisions, in which case that leads you to a more fundamental issue. But there's sometimes when you just make decisions, and those decisions do create more actions, and that's the nature of decisions. They lead to other kinds of decisions. And that by itself is not necessarily a problem.
Okay, well, I'm not going to commit that cardinal sin of meetings, which would be to run over. So it being 12:59 Eastern Time, I guess I'm going to have to say, Roger, this has been a great presentation, but I'm afraid we're out of time. So I want to thank, first of all, Roger, I want to thank you for sharing your thoughts.
You're welcome. I'm happy to do it, Julia. And on that last screen in front of you as we leave, you'll see some extra resources if people are interested. I've talked about 8 behaviors for smarter teams on there, and you can go and get those resources free, and that can help people have more effective meetings. Thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
Thank you for including those. And of course, I want to thank all of our listeners for joining us today. And with that, let's conclude our presentation. Have a great day.